They married their blind daughter to the most cruel sovereign of the Northern Territories. The one they whispered was a vampire king. Those were the words that drifted like poisonous smoke among the back pews of the church, while the echoes of the heavy stone walls mixed with the cloying scent of frankincense and the smell of wilted lilies. She could not see the faces of the townspeople who observed her with a mix of pity and horror, but she felt every gaze upon her skin like the prickling of 1,000 needles. She felt the heavy tension of the air, the held breath of her mother, and the slight rhythmic tremor in the hands of the priest. The only thing she did not feel was the warmth of the hand of the man to whom she was being joined for all eternity. The king, the man about whom everyone spoke in hushed, terrified tones, the one who returned from the border wars with scars that no human eyes dared to linger upon for too long, the one who wore his dark, ornate uniform even on the holiest of days, and whose lips never knew the curve of a smile. The blind daughter only knew his name, Alistair, and she knew that he was a widower who had loved once long ago in a century she could only imagine. Now they said he was a creature of shadow, incapable of loving anyone. What no one imagined on that sweltering morning in the town of Milton, Maine, was that it would not be the church, nor the master bedroom, nor the long mahogany dining table where this union would become real. It would be a night of thunder and fury in the stables, amidst the scent of dry hay, falling rain, and damp skin. And that night would change everything they thought they knew about monsters and saints. Her name was Evelyn. She was just over 20 years old, with skin as soft as the petals of a white rose, and long chestnut hair gathered in a braid that reached nearly to her waist. Her eyes were large and clear, but they had been empty of light since a violent fever had stolen her sight when she was only a small child. People said that from the outside she looked like a fragile porcelain doll, a relic of a gentler time. From the inside, no one knew who she was because no one ever thought to ask. Her mother, Rose, squeezed her rosary beads so hard her knuckles turned white as the priest recited the ancient words of the marriage covenant. This was not a marriage born of love or even common affection. It was a cold, calculated agreement. King Alistair had forgiven a massive debt that threatened to cast Evelyn's family into the freezing streets, and in exchange he demanded Evelyn's hand. It was that or lose the man or the land, and the very last shred of security they possessed. "Do you take this man to be your husband?" the priest asked, his voice wavering. Evelyn swallowed hard. She could not see the altar or the crucifix. She could not see the face of the king, but she felt him standing there, a mountain of silent, freezing energy. He gave off a different kind of heat, not the warmth of a living man, but a heavy, magnetic presence that felt like the weight of 1,000 years pressing down on the church floor. "I do," she responded, her voice low, but strangely firm. The priest repeated the question for him. "Do you take this woman to be your wife?" There was a silence so brief it felt like a heartbeat skipped, and then a deep, raspy voice that sounded like the shifting of tectonic plates. "I do." He did not say her name. He did not say Evelyn. He only accepted the bond. She felt a sharp pang in her chest, a sudden realization of her own solitude. When they brought his hand to hers so she could touch him for the first time, she noticed the skin was unnaturally smooth and cold, the fingers possessing a strength that felt like iron wrapped in silk. A prominent scar crossed the back of his hand. He did not squeeze her hand in return. He barely made contact before withdrawing into the shadows of his cloak. They were married thus with words that sounded more like a business contract than a sacred promise, and yet that union, sealed under the murmurs of the curious and the fearful, hid a story that not even the vampire king himself was prepared to endure. The afternoon was heavy and humid when they finally arrived at the vast estate of the king. Evelyn could not see the dark, jagged silhouette of the manor house cutting against the grey main sky, nor the Gothic arches of the courtyard, or the high, narrow windows that overlooked the wild gardens. But she felt it all with a heightened clarity that the sighted could never understand. She felt the change of the ground beneath her feet, moving from the loose gravel of the road to the smooth, ancient stone of the driveway. She heard the echo of servants' voices fluttering like startled birds, the clinking of metal buckets, the creaking of leather saddles, and the rhythmic splash of the fountain in the center of the courtyard. Most of all, she felt his presence a few paces away, always near, always silent, like a shadow that had forgotten how to speak. "I will help you upstairs, my lady," said a kind, feminine voice at her side. It was Rachel, one of the head maids. She took Evelyn's arm with a gentle touch and guided her toward the sweeping grand staircase. "Your room is ready, my king," another voice announced from the darkness of the hall. "And the ladies' room is prepared as well." Evelyn caught the detail immediately. The ladies' room, not their room. They were to have separate quarters. She felt a small wave of relief mixed with a confusing sense of disappointment. She didn't understand why she felt let down by the distance. She climbed the stairs with careful deliberation, counting each step in her mind to map her new world. Rachel whispered descriptions as they walked. The hallway was long and lined with velvet. There were paintings to the right that felt like they were watching, and heavy oak doors to the left. "Here," the maid said softly. "This will be your room, my lady." They stopped, and Evelyn heard the heavy thud of the door opening. She inhaled the scent of polished cedar, clean linen and fresh lavender arranged in a glass jar. "Thank you," Evelyn murmured. Behind her, at the far end of the hallway, she heard the rhythmic, heavy click of the king's boots, moving away without a word, without a glance, even though she could not have seen it if he had stayed. That first night, Evelyn slept alone in a bed that felt far too large in a house she did not know, beside a man whose hand she had barely touched. The silence of the manor was not like the silence of her father's home. It was a dense, living thing, filled with the faint hum of old magic and the rustling of the wind against the stone. She lay awake for hours, listening to the house breathe. She did not know yet that before the moon completed its cycle, her hands would travel over the scarred and frozen skin of that man. She did not know that her scent would mingle with the aroma of expensive soap and warm water, or that he would reach a point where he would tremble under the simple touch of her fingertips. She could not have guessed that the night in the stables would not be a momentary lapse in judgment, but the only way both of them would find to feel truly alive in a world that had tried to bury them in darkness. She felt the cold air seeping through the window cracks and pulled the duvet tighter, wondering if the king ever slept, or if he simply stood in the shadows, waiting for the sun to hide so he could reclaim his kingdom. In the days that followed, Evelyn began to know her husband through sounds, silences, and the hushed comments of the staff. He was Alistair Thorne, but in the surrounding villages of Milton they simply called him the King of Shadows. He had spent half a lifetime, or perhaps several lifetimes, on the back of a horse at the head of armed men defending the borders of his realm, quelling rebellions, and obeying the ancient laws of his kind. He had seen too much blood, too many losses, and too many nights without the comfort of a hearth. At some point in his long journey, something inside him had hardened so thoroughly that people stopped talking about a man and began talking about a statue of obsidian. Evelyn heard him giving orders in the courtyard with a voice that was firm and devoid of doubt. "Faster, that is not sufficient. Do not fail me again." He never raised his voice to her directly, but he also never directed many words her way. Every morning, Rachel helped her dress, explaining where the window was located, where the wardrobe stood, and where the velvet chair was placed. Evelyn memorized every inch of the room with the patience of a weaver. In the afternoons, they allowed her to play the old grand piano in the drawing room. Her fingers, which could not see the ivory keys, moved as if they were searching for a light that was not in her eyes, but in the vibration of the strings. Sometimes, while she played a melancholic sonata, she felt the unmistakable presence of the king in the doorway. He said nothing. Evelyn could not see him, but she perceived his rhythmic breathing, the slight creak of his leather belt, and the suppressed murmur of his voice when he occasionally answered a servant's question. He never approached too closely. He remained at a calculated distance, as if she were a piece of fine crystal that he did not know how to touch without shattering. It was nearly a week before anyone dared to speak to her about his scars. It happened while Rachel was brushing her long hair. "Is it true that the king has scars on his face?" Evelyn asked, her curiosity finally overcoming her hesitation. The maid hesitated, the brush pausing mid-stroke. "On his face and his body, my lady," she finally replied in a whisper. "They say every mark is from a battle that would have killed a mortal man. They say that is why he is the way he is, because he has seen the end of the world too many times." That night, while they ate dinner at the incredibly long dining table, Evelyn gathered her courage to do something she had not yet dared. She reached out her hand toward where she knew he was sitting. She could not see the silver plate or the crystal glass or his face, but she extended her fingers with trembling care until she grazed his forearm. She felt skin that was cool to the touch, and the texture of a long, jagged scar that crossed the muscle of his arm. Alistair tensed instantly. For a second, it felt as though he might pull away violently, but he remained still, a frozen statue. Evelyn let her fingers linger, tracing the path of the scar as if she were reading a story written in a forgotten language. "Does it hurt?" she asked in a soft, melodic voice. He took several seconds to respond, and when he did, the words felt like they were being dragged from a deep well. "No longer," he finally said. "What truly hurts does not leave marks on the outside." Evelyn withdrew her hand, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. It was not a kind phrase, but it lacked the iron hardness he used with his soldiers. It was the first crack in his armor, the first sign that there was a soul buried beneath the weight of his crown. 2 weeks after the wedding, Rachel entered Evelyn's room one afternoon with an unusual sense of shyness. "My lady, the king has requested something." "Tell me," Evelyn replied, sitting on the edge of her bed. The maid cleared her throat, her voice dropping an octave. "He wishes for you to help him with his bath." Evelyn felt a sudden intense heat rise to her cheeks. "Me?" she whispered, her hands clutching the silk bedspread. "You are his wife," Rachel said gently, "and the physician once said that warm water helps with the old aches in his bones. Usually the valet does it, but today he has asked for you." The idea terrified her, and at the same time lit a fire deep within her. She had never seen a man's body, never even truly seen her own, beyond what her hands could recognize in the dark. To think of the scars of the king's marked skin under the water made her hands tremble. "Very well," she said, after a long moment of silence. "Tell him I will come." The king's bathing chamber smelled of pine soap, damp wood, and the metallic tang of heated iron. Evelyn entered slowly, guided by Rachel, to the table where the basins, jugs, and soft towels were arranged. "I will leave you here, my lady," the maid whispered, before retreating and closing the heavy door. When she was gone, the silence took on a new, heavy quality. Evelyn heard the soft splash of water as he moved. "You may come closer," Alistair said, with that grave voice he rarely used directly with her. Evelyn moved forward with her hands extended until her fingers touched the cold stone rim of the massive tub. The water was steaming, filling the air with a thick, humid vapor. "Tell me, what do you wish for me to do?" she murmured. There was a moment of hesitation. "Just wash my back," he replied. "That is all." Evelyn took a sponge, dipped it into the warm water, squeezed it out carefully, and pressed it against the king's skin. She saw nothing, but her hands saw everything. She felt his broad shoulders as hard as the stones of the manor, and the scars, some as thin as silken threads, others as thick and gnarled as old rope. She felt the tension in his neck every time she moved near a mark. She moved slowly, with a profound sense of respect, as if she were touching a forbidden history. In one moment, the sponge slipped slightly toward his side, descending further than she had intended. Her wet fingers brushed against his waist, the line where his body became more intimate. Alistair tensed with the speed of a predator. His hand shot out of the water and gripped her wrist with a strength that was staggering. He did not hurt her, but he held her fast. Evelyn gasped, her breath catching in her throat. They were close, incredibly close. He pulled her wrist toward him so that she lost her balance and had to lean forward, supporting her other hand on the stone rim. She could feel the radiant cold heat of his body under the water. She could smell his skin, a mixture of expensive soap, rainwater, and something deeply ancient, masculine. "You do not have to," he said, his voice coming out as a low growl. "Do not touch where I have not asked." It wasn't a shout or a command. It sounded more like a plea that he didn't know how to disguise. Evelyn swallowed hard. "I am your wife," she whispered the words, surprising even her. There was a thick, heavy silence. "That is precisely why," he replied. Bringing his face so close to hers, she could feel the coolness of his breath, even though she couldn't see the depth of his dark eyes. "Because you are, and I do not wish to treat you the way life has treated me." He loosened his grip on her wrist, pulled away and muttered, "That is enough for today. You may go." Evelyn stood there for a long time after he left, her heart pounding. Her entire body felt awake, as if her skin were filled with electric sparks. They had not been intimate, but something had been ignited, and she knew it would not be easily extinguished. In the days that followed, the king avoided calling her to the bath. Evelyn felt the distance growing between them like a physical chasm. It wasn't just physical. It was as if he feared coming too close, not for her sake, but because of what she stirred within his own frozen heart. She, for her part, found herself thinking of his body more often than she cared to admit. She remembered the breadth of his shoulders under the sponge, the rough texture of the scars, and the contained power in the hand that had held her wrist. At night, alone in her bed, she replayed the scene 1,000 times. She felt the warmth rise to her face and chest. She told herself it was shameful, but she couldn't stop. She was supposed to share a bed with him. As his wife, it was her duty to give him her body without question. But he slept in another wing of the manor, and the only contact they had shared beyond a hand on a hand had been that interrupted bath. She realized there was something broken in the king, something that did not allow him to reach out. Even though his breathing became heavy whenever she was near, he saw himself as a monster, a creature of the night. She didn't fully understand his nature yet, but she was discovering him through small, subtle gestures. She remembered when he heard her trip in the garden, and he had run to her. She heard the speed of his movement faster than any human, to catch her before she hit the ground. She remembered when he had a gentle, slow-stepping horse brought to her. "I do not want you to live in darkness inside the house," he had said. "This horse will carry you along the paths. You will learn to orient yourself by the wind and the slope of the land." It didn't sound sweet, but the action was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for her. One afternoon, Evelyn felt a desperate need for the comfort of warm water on her skin. She had spent the morning mapping the gardens with Rachel's help, memorizing every turn and every bench. She asked for the bath in her own room to be prepared. Rachel helped her undress with delicate care. Evelyn never saw her own reflection, but she knew her body through touch, The slender arms, the chest that rose and fell more quickly since her arrival at the estate, the gentle curve of her waist. She stepped into the water with a long sigh, closing her eyes. Though seeing or not seeing changed nothing of her world, she stayed like that for a long time, her long hair floating on the surface, her skin alternating between burning and cooling when she heard something she did not expect, the door opening. "I thought—" Alistair's voice stopped abruptly. Evelyn instinctively covered herself with her arms, though the water and the steam already hid much of her. "Forgive me," he murmured. "I did not know you were here." The silence was filled with the sound of water dripping from the ceiling and the creaking of the old wood. Evelyn felt exposed, but she also felt a strange new strength. "It is my bath," she said, "and it is my body." It wasn't a complaint. It was a simple, undeniable truth. Alistair did not leave. He closed the door behind him and took a few steps closer. "You are right," he conceded. "But I am a man, Evelyn. I'm not used to entering a room," and he stopped. "I do not want to look at you in a way I should not." Evelyn smiled slightly, a small, sad curve of her lips. "I am your wife," she said softly. "How then should you look at me?" He let out a low, mirthless laugh. "Therein lies the problem," he replied. "I am not certain I deserve to look at you the way a man looks at his wife." He approached until she could feel his presence right beside the tub. His calloused hand rested on the stone rim, very near to her own. "If you do not wish for me to stay, I will leave right now," he added. Evelyn hesitated. Her heart pushed her in one direction, her upbringing in another. "Stay," she whispered at last. "I will not break because you are near." He did not move for several seconds. Then, with great care, he took a small jug, filled it with water, and poured it over her shoulders. The warm water cascaded down her back in a rhythmic, soothing flow. Her skin erupted in goosebumps. "Tell me if this bothers you," Alistair said, his voice even deeper than before. "I only wish to help you rinse away the soap." Evelyn let the water fall, closing her eyes and tilting her head forward, leaving her neck exposed and vulnerable. She felt the path of the liquid as it travelled down her nape, slid along her spine, and vanished beneath the surface of the water. His hand, still holding the jug, accidentally brushed her bare shoulder. It was a minimal contact, but it awakened something as intense as the first bath. Her chest began to rise and fall with increasing speed. She realized from his sudden silence that the king had also noticed the change in her breathing. The tension became almost unbearable. The sensation of being naked, surrounded by water with this man so close, was a mixture of fear, desire, and something profoundly ancient. Then, before anything could go too far, he pulled his hand away. "It is done," he said, his voice sounding raspy and strained. "I should not. I do not wish to take advantage of your trust." And he left. Evelyn remained alone in the tub, trembling not from the cold, but from a fire that had been dormant for too many years. In the following weeks, time at the manor was measured in small, quiet gestures. Evelyn began to recognize the king's footsteps. She knew when he arrived, exhausted from his duties, when he was in a dark mood, or when something had happened in the nearby villages. Sometimes in the dining room, he would suddenly break the long silence. "Have you grown accustomed to the hallways yet?" he would ask. "Almost," she would respond. "I still lose my way near the gallery at the back." He would click his tongue, seemingly annoyed with himself. "I should have a railing installed there," he would murmur. He never said, "I don't want you to fall." But the sentiment was there, buried under layers of duty. Other times, the closeness turned back into a sharp rejection. One night, Evelyn, gathering all her courage, walked to the door of Alistair's study. She stopped, took a deep breath, and knocked with her knuckles. "What is it?" he asked from within. "I only wanted to talk," she replied. She heard heavy footsteps approaching. The door opened and she was hit by the scent of tobacco, old parchment, and damp leather. "It is late," he said. "You should be asleep." "I am your wife," she dared to say, her voice trembling but steady. "I do not know if I should sleep alone every single night." There was a heavy, suffocating silence. "Precisely because you are," he replied, a note of pain vibrating in his voice. "I do not want to use your body just to forget the shadows in my head. I do not want to treat you like the world has treated me." Evelyn felt a knot tighten in her chest. "Not every man who touches a woman does so to forget," she murmured. "Some do it to remember they are still alive." He took a step back, and the distance between them grew once more. "Good night, Evelyn," he said, and closed the door with a soft but final click. She stood there for a few seconds, her hand in the air touching the void where his chest had been. The horse he had given her was named Ember. He was a noble animal with a steady gait, seeming to understand that the young woman who rode him could not see the path ahead. He allowed himself to be guided by the touch of her hands and the soft, melodic voice she used to speak to him. "You are the only one who lets me feel the world without fear," Evelyn would say, stroking his dark mane. He took her on long rides around the estate, always with a stable hand nearby, just in case, though she never knew that the king often observed her from a distance. One afternoon, the sky began to darken much earlier than usual. The clouds became heavy with a bruised grey colour. The wind shifted direction, and the scent of ozone and wet earth became overwhelming. The thunder followed soon after. "It is better if you do not ride today, my lady," Rachel warned. "A storm is coming." But Evelyn was restless. She felt her chest tightening as if she needed to breathe air that didn't belong to the rooms of the manor. "I am only going to the stables," she replied. "I want to make sure Ember is calm." She took her walking stick and, guided by the sound of the rain that was beginning to fall, she descended the stairs, crossed the courtyard, and followed the stone path to the stables. The rain hit the tiled roof with a violent intensity. The lightning, though she could not see it, made the interior of the barn vibrate. The horses were huffing and restless. Ember was kicking at the wooden slats of his stall. "Easy, Ember," she whispered, finding him by the sound of his movements. "It's only me. Nothing is going to happen." She stroked his neck, feeling the damp, warm skin and the smell of animals and wet hay. A particularly loud clap of thunder made the entire structure shake. Evelyn grit her teeth to keep from crying out, but her hand trembled against the horse's flank. "Everything is fine," she repeated more for herself than the animal. Back in the house, a groom approached the king with a frantic voice. "My king, the lady is in the stables. The storm is fierce, and the roof is old." Alistair stood up from his chair so fast it nearly toppled. His heart gave a strange, jagged leap, the kind of leap he hadn't felt in centuries of war. Without a second thought, he grabbed his heavy coat, but didn't wait to put it on. He ran into the courtyard under the pouring rain, his uniform only half-buttoned. The water lashed against his face, sliding over his scars and soaking into his collar, but he did not slow down. Every step toward the stables was an echo of a primal fear of losing the only thing that had brought light into his dark world. He had lost too much in his long life. He was not prepared to add his wife to that list, even if he still didn't allow himself to touch her properly. When he burst into the stables, the mixture of smells hit him instantly: wet hay, horse sweat, and the delicate floral perfume of Evelyn. "Evelyn!" he called out. His voice was softer, more vulnerable than it had ever been. She turned toward the sound of his voice, her empty eyes searching the darkness she always lived in. "I am here," she responded. "Ember is frightened." Alistair approached, guided by her voice. The horse calmed noticeably as he sensed the king's powerful presence. Evelyn was completely soaked. Her dress clung to her body, tracing the curves he had spent weeks trying not to imagine. Her hair was loose, clinging to her face like a dark silken curtain. "Are you mad?" he said, his tone harsh to hide the terror he felt. "Something could have fallen on you, a beam, a lightning strike, anything." She lifted her chin proudly. "I did not want to leave Ember alone," she replied. "Darkness does not scare me. I'm accustomed to it." Another thunderclap made the ground vibrate. Evelyn gave an involuntary jump. Alistair saw it. "But the noise does," he said more gently. He moved closer. She felt the magnetic heat of his body despite how wet he was. "Are you all right?" he asked. Evelyn swallowed hard. "Yes and no," she whispered. "I am tired of feeling like an object in this house, like a burden, like something that isn't enough." Her voice broke. "I feel that you do not want me," she added in a whisper that was barely audible over the rain. The question hung in the air like a silent lightning bolt. Alistair felt something inside his chest tear open. "Do not say that," he murmured. Evelyn pressed her lips together. "Then why do you not touch me? Why do you sleep so far away? Why do you pull back every time I come near?" The king closed his eyes, as if even breathing caused him pain. "Because I love you more than I should," he confessed at last, "and because I am afraid." Evelyn frowned. "Afraid of what?" she whispered. He took another step, closing the final gap between them. Now they were so close. She could feel the rain dripping from his chest onto her hands. She could smell the rain, the leather, and his skin. "Afraid of being what I know I can be," he said. "A monster, a creature that is led by the hunger in his body and forgets the heart of the person he holds. I know how men like me treat women when they only want to extinguish the fire inside. I have seen it, and I do not want you to be a part of that. I do not want to turn you into another scar." Evelyn felt her eyes fill with tears. She had no light, but she had tears. "You are not a monster," she said. "Not when you give me a horse so I can know the world. Not when you worry about the hallways of the manor. Not when you let me touch your scars without pulling away." Her trembling hands found his chest. The wet shirt was stuck to his skin. She felt the texture of a thick scar under her palm. "This," she said, pressing gently, "this is not just pain. These are stories, battles, and choices. And even after all of that, you are still here standing. You have changed, but you are here." Alistair trembled under her touch. The noise of the storm seemed to recede for a moment. There were only the two of them, the rhythmic breathing of the horse, and the silence of things that had taken too long to be born. Evelyn was soaked, her dress clinging to every line of her body. The king noticed the way her chest rose and fell. The desire he had contained for so long fought to break free. "You do not know what you are asking," he murmured. "You have not seen what I am capable of." She smiled sadly. "Alistair, I see nothing," she responded, "but I feel everything, and what I feel now is not fear." Her fingers slid upward, grazing the line where his chest met his neck. His pulse was fast, frantic. "If you truly love me," Evelyn said, "do not leave me alone in this darkness that isn't just in my eyes. Stay here with me, not as a king, but as a man." The next thunderclap sounded far away. The storm was beginning to move on. Inside the stable, however, something was just beginning. Alistair lifted his hand, and this time he did not stop halfway. His fingers brushed Evelyn's cheek, followed the line to her chin, and held her face with an aching tenderness. She tilted her head into his hand, seeking the contact like a traveler seeks a hearth in the night. He stepped forward. Their bodies met, pressed together by the wet fabric of their clothes. Evelyn could feel his firm chest against her own. The heat that passed through the soaked layers was overwhelming. "I do not want to hurt you," he whispered. "Then do not let go," she replied. It was a slow kiss, hesitant at first, filled with years of containment and repressed longing. There was no rush, no brutality, just lips finding each other for the first time, insecure hands searching for where to rest without breaking anything. Their breaths mingled with the scent of hay and rain. Evelyn clung to his shirt, feeling the fabric twist in her fingers. Alistair let one of his hands descend to the small of her back, following the curve to her waist. He paused for a second, asking for permission in the silence, and she responded by pulling him closer. No more words were needed. There, among the quieted horses and the fading storm, the blind daughter and the scarred king ceased to be strangers bound by a contract. They became at last husband and wife. The hay was their witness, the rain their accomplice, and their bodies finally found a rhythm of their own, intimate, sacred, and known only to them. Life at the Milton estate did not change overnight. There were no grand announcements or dramatic gestures before the staff, but Evelyn felt the difference in the smallest of ways. Alistair began to knock on her door every evening, and instead of leaving, he would come in and sit beside her while she rested. He would take her hand in silence and remain there until her breathing became slow and deep with sleep. In the courtyard, his orders remained firm, but the underlying cruelty was gone. The harsh punishments for small mistakes vanished. The servants began to whisper that the King of Shadows had finally found his son. No one knew that the night in the stables had been the exact moment the obsidian statue had cracked and revealed a human heart. Evelyn no longer felt like an object traded to settle a debt. She felt chosen not out of obligation, but for the soul she was able to awaken in a man who had considered himself a monster for centuries. Sometimes, when the wind blew strong from the north, she would ask to go down to the stables with him. They didn't always need passion. Sometimes they just stood there breathing the same air, remembering without words that it was that humble place that gave them a second chance at life. Through this journey, they learned that the greatest blindness is not the absence of light in the eyes, but the absence of empathy in the heart. We often walk through our lives like Alistair, building walls of stone and ice to protect ourselves from old wounds, convinced that our scars make us unlovable or monstrous. We hide behind titles, duties, and silence, fearing that if anyone saw the truth of our brokenness, they would turn away in horror. Yet it is often in our most vulnerable moments, when we are stripped of our defenses by the storms of life, that we are finally able to be seen. Evelyn, though she lived in physical darkness, possessed the true vision, the ability to look past the surface and recognize the value of a soul. She taught us that love is not about finding someone perfect, but about having the courage to touch the scars of another and ask if they still hurt. It is a lesson for all stages of life that true intimacy requires the bravery to be naked before another, not just physically, but emotionally. When we stop viewing others as objects or solutions to our problems and begin to see them as fellow travelers with their own burdens, the world changes. The walls we built to keep the pain out also kept the joy from coming in. By letting someone in, we don't just heal them, we find the parts of ourselves we thought were lost forever. Kindness and patience are the only keys that can unlock a heart that has been frozen by time and sorrow. In the end, the most beautiful stories are not those without shadows, but those where two people find each other in the dark and decide to hold on until the morning comes.